What would you do if an entire galaxy looked at your species and decided you didn't deserve a place to call home? Not a war. Not an invasion. Just a quiet, bureaucratic decision, stamped and filed, that erased your future without ever raising a weapon. That is exactly what happened to humanity. In the year 2189, 17 years after first contact, the interstellar Concord, a council of 9 founding species governing 400 systems, gathered to decide the fate of a species that had barely learned to walk among the stars. The vote was not close. 8 votes to 1. Humanity was denied colonization rights to every habitable world within Concord space. Not because humans had committed a crime. Not because they had broken a treaty. But because of a single line buried in the Concord's Habitability Assessment Report, a report humans weren't even permitted to see until after the vote had already passed. Subject species exhibits insufficient physiological, psychological, and technological stability for sustained extraterrestrial habitation. Recommend indefinite denial of terraforming and colonization licenses. In plain language, the galaxy had decided humans were too fragile, too unstable, and too primitive to survive anywhere but Earth. To understand how insulting this was, you have to understand who was saying it. The Concord was led by the Virilu, an ancient insectoid civilization whose ancestors had already been navigating interstellar space when humanity's ancestors were still learning to control fire. The Virilu were patient, methodical, and utterly convinced that intelligence was measured in millennia, not centuries. To them, humanity was a toddler who had wandered into a room full of adults and started shouting about how it deserved a seat at the table. Beside the Virilu sat the Kesh Dominion, a militarized reptilian empire that had subdued 11 star systems through sheer force, and viewed humanity's chaotic, decentralized governments as proof of an unfit species, a species too busy fighting itself to be trusted with the stars. And then there were the Ordanis, silicon-based lifeforms who processed information through direct neural linkage and found humanity's slow, emotional, argument-driven decision-making almost physically painful to witness. In Concord meetings, Ordani's delegates had been recorded describing human diplomacy as biological noise mistaken for communication. Humanity had arrived at the galactic stage only 17 years earlier, stunned, overwhelmed, and desperately trying to prove it belonged. Every human ambassador who stood before the Concord did so with genuine hope that if they just explained themselves clearly enough, humbly enough, the galaxy would see what humanity had to offer. Instead, they were handed a verdict. Earth's ambassador, Dr. Amara Osei, a soft-spoken former astrophysicist turned reluctant diplomat, stood in the vast obsidian chamber of the Concord Assembly on the day the ruling was announced. 9 species. Thousands of years of combined history. And all of it aimed at one small, blue planet that had only just learned it wasn't alone. The Virilu speaker, a being whose voice came out as a series of layered harmonics translated into flat, emotionless standard, delivered the final judgment without ceremony. Humanity may retain its home system. Humanity may continue trade under existing agreements. Humanity may not expand. This matter is closed. There was no debate. No appeal process offered. Just a closed door, politely and permanently. Osei asked the only question that mattered: for how long? The speaker's answer became infamous across every human network within hours. Species maturity is not measured in units convenient to your species. Perhaps in 1,000 years, this council will reconsider. 1,000 years. Humanity had barely finished healing from its own worst wars. It had barely learned to build ships that could survive a jump through a wormhole without shaking apart. And now the most powerful civilizations in the known galaxy had just told an entire species, calmly and without malice, that its ambitions ended at the edge of its own solar system, indefinitely. Back on Earth, the reaction wasn't rage. It was something quieter, and in some ways more devastating: humiliation. 8 billion people had watched their species be told, on galactic record, that they were unfit. Not unfit for war. Not unfit for trade. Unfit to simply exist beyond their own front door. Children who had grown up dreaming of colony ships and new worlds now grew up watching news broadcasts explain, in careful diplomatic language, that those dreams had been legally cancelled by a council humanity didn't elect and couldn't overrule. For the first time since first contact, a strange, heavy silence settled over Earth's cities. And in that silence, something the Concord never accounted for began to happen. Humanity stopped talking to the stars. And started building. For the next 6 years, the Concord heard almost nothing from Earth. No formal protests. No appeals to reconsider the ruling. No angry ambassadors pounding on obsidian doors demanding justice. To the 9 founding species, this silence was interpreted exactly how you'd expect an ancient, patient civilization to interpret it. Acceptance. The Virulus speaker noted in an internal Concord memo, later leaked decades afterward, that humanity's silence confirmed the Council's assessment: subject species demonstrates appropriate deference following correction. No further intervention required. They had no idea how wrong they were. Because while the Concord assumed humanity had simply given up, something else entirely was happening across Earth, quietly, in laboratories, shipyards, and underground research facilities that rarely made it into any diplomatic transmission. It started with a question nobody in the Concord had ever seriously asked: what if a species didn't need a habitable planet at all? Every species in the Concord defined livable the same way: a planet within a narrow band of temperature, atmosphere, and gravity, similar enough to their homeworld that survival required minimal engineering. It was, in essence, a galaxy of civilizations looking for slightly different versions of home. Humanity had been denied access to every one of those worlds. So a small, unfunded research initiative based out of a repurposed orbital station above Earth, nicknamed, almost sarcastically, Project Threshold, began asking a very different question. What if humans stopped looking for a planet to live on, and started building somewhere to live instead? The idea wasn't new. Humans had dreamed about deep space habitats and generation ships for over a century before first contact. But dreaming about something and actually engineering it to survive the brutal, radiation-soaked, gravity-less void of interstellar space were two very different things. The problem was staggering. Deep space had no atmosphere to breathe, no gravity to walk in, no magnetic field to block cosmic radiation, no sunlight reliable enough to grow food, and no resources within reach to build or repair anything. Every single system that made a planet habitable simply didn't exist out there. Every other species in the galaxy had taken one look at those conditions and concluded exactly what the Virula Habitability Report had concluded about humans: it wasn't survivable. Not permanently. Not as a home. But humanity had one advantage the Concord had underestimated completely. Humans were used to solving problems with what they didn't have. Dr. Amara Osei, no longer welcome at Concord functions but far from finished, became one of Project Threshold's earliest and fiercest supporters. She had stood in that obsidian chamber and heard humanity called unfit. She had come home with a promise to herself that she intended to keep quietly, patiently, for as long as it took. They didn't deny us a home, she told a closed session of engineers and scientists in the project's second year. They denied us a shortcut. That's not the same thing. The engineering challenges were brutal, and this story doesn't pretend they weren't. The first attempt at a rotating deep space habitat, a torus-shaped structure designed to simulate gravity through centrifugal spin, suffered a catastrophic structural failure during pressure testing in 2196, killing 3 engineers and setting the program back nearly a year. It would have been easy, at that point, for the funding to dry up, for the political will to vanish, for humanity to quietly accept the Concord's judgment after all. Instead, something changed in how the project moved forward. Survivors of the failure, including lead structural engineer Priya Chandrasekhar, insisted on staying on the project rather than stepping away. In interviews given years later, she described that period simply: we weren't trying to prove something to the aliens anymore. We were trying to prove something to ourselves. That's a different kind of stubborn. The second habitat design abandoned rigid, single-hull construction entirely, borrowing an idea from an unlikely source, Earth's own oceans. Deep-sea submersibles had long used modular, redundant pressure systems, so that damage to one section didn't collapse the whole structure. Human engineers adapted the same philosophy to vacuum, layered, self-sealing modules, each capable of surviving isolated failure without endangering the rest of the habitat. It worked. By 2199, the first true prototype, a modest habitat named Anchor 1, achieved stable rotation, livable internal pressure, and a self-contained atmosphere recycling system capable of supporting a 12-person crew indefinitely, using no planetary resources at all. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't fast. But it was real. Meanwhile, an entirely separate problem loomed just as large: radiation. Deep space, far from the protective magnetic fields of any planet, bathed everything in a constant storm of cosmic rays and solar particles. Long-term exposure was a death sentence for any biological crew. The solution that emerged wasn't a single miracle breakthrough, it was hundreds of incremental human innovations layered together. Water itself, cheap and abundant when harvested from ice-rich asteroids, turned out to be one of the most effective radiation shields available, so habitat designs began incorporating massive water-lined outer layers, serving double duty as both radiation protection and emergency life support reserves. Combined with electromagnetic deflector arrays, smaller, cheaper, and far more efficient than anything the Concorde had ever bothered developing, since no Concorde species had ever needed to protect a habitat with no planet to hide behind, human engineers slowly closed the gap between survivable and livable. Food was its own war. Early hydroponic systems struggled to produce enough calories to sustain even a small crew, let alone a growing population. It took nearly 4 years of failed harvests, malnourished test crews, and painstaking agricultural science before Earth's botanists cracked a stable, closed-loop food production system, vertical algae-based protein farms combined with genetically optimized crops bred specifically for zero gravity and low light efficiency. None of this was secret in the sense of being hidden from the galaxy. The Concorde simply wasn't watching. Why would they? As far as the 9 founding species were concerned, the matter had been settled 6 years earlier. Humanity had been told no, humanity had gone quiet, and quiet species, in the Concorde's long and patient experience, were species that had accepted their place. What the Concorde failed to understand, what it had never bothered to learn about humans at all, was that quiet wasn't the same as finished. By 2202, Earth had launched 4 fully operational deep space habitats, none of them orbiting a planet, none of them requesting Concorde permission, because none of them technically violated the ruling at all. The Concorde had denied humanity colonization rights to habitable worlds. No one had ever thought to write a rule against building somewhere to live in the empty space between the stars, because no one had ever imagined a species would try. By 2205, Earth's deep space population had grown past 10,000 souls, spread across a small but rapidly expanding network of interconnected habitats humans had begun calling, with a certain grim pride, the Threshold Belt. And still, the Concorde noticed nothing. Until one habitat did something no one, human or alien, had thought possible. The discovery that changed everything happened almost by accident, the way most of history's turning points do. In late 2206, a Kesh Dominion long-range survey vessel, the Vashtka, was mapping an unclaimed stretch of deep space roughly 11 light-years from the nearest Concorde-recognized system, a stretch of empty void that, according to every Concorde record, contained absolutely nothing of interest. No planets. No resources worth extracting. No reason for any civilized species to be there. Its sensors picked up something that shouldn't have existed. A cluster of large, artificial structures, radiating stable heat signatures, breathable atmosphere readings, and, most alarmingly to the Kesh crew, coordinated energy output consistent with a sustained, thriving population. The Kesh captain, a hardened veteran named Dross Kelvan, assumed at first it was a malfunction in his sensor array. Nothing lived out here. Nothing could live out here. There was no planet to anchor to, no star close enough to provide meaningful warmth, nothing but the void the Concorde itself had long ago classified as uninhabitable by any known standard. He ordered a closer pass. What his crew found defied every assumption the galaxy had built its understanding of home around. 7 massive rotating structures, connected by a lattice of transit tubes and cargo lines, orbited nothing at all. They simply hung in open space, generating their own gravity through rotation, their own light through carefully angled solar collectors positioned to catch even the faintest starlight from the nearest distant sun, their own atmosphere through systems so tightly closed-loop that almost nothing escaped to waste. And painted, unmistakably, in bold human lettering across the largest structure's outer hull, was a name. Meridian Station, population 41,000. 41,000 humans. Living. Not surviving in some desperate, temporary emergency shelter, living. Farming, working, raising children, running schools, operating manufacturing lines, none of it dependent on a single planet, moon, or Concorde-approved world. Captain Dross Kelvon did something almost unheard of for a Kesh Dominion officer. He hesitated to file his report, because he genuinely did not know how his superiors would react to something the Concorde's own scientific doctrine had declared theoretically impossible less than a decade earlier. When the report finally reached the Concorde Assembly, it didn't arrive as a quiet scientific update. It arrived as a full diplomatic crisis. The Virulus speaker who had once declared, with total confidence, that humanity's habitat failures made it unfit for the stars was forced to sit through an emergency session reviewing sensor data, structural analysis, and, most damning of all, direct communications intercepted from Meridian Station itself. Casual conversations between human engineers discussing crop yields and school curriculums as though building a permanent civilization in the vacuum of deep space was simply Tuesday. It hadn't been a single miracle. That was the part that took the Concorde's best scientists the longest to accept. There was no secret alien technology involved, no forbidden knowledge stolen or stumbled upon. Every component of Meridian Station, the modular hull design born from a fatal accident and a stubborn refusal to quit, the water-shielding radiation system built from cheap asteroid ice, the closed-loop agriculture perfected after years of failed harvests, the rotational gravity systems refined through a decade of trial, error, and quiet persistence, had been achievable, in theory, by any Concorde species for centuries. None of them had ever tried. Because none of them had ever needed to. That was the detail that unsettled the Concorde more than any single piece of technology could have. Every founding species had a homeworld, or had simply taken one from someone weaker. None of them had ever been denied a home and told to figure it out anyway. Humanity had. And instead of breaking under that denial, humanity had spent 6 patient, unglamorous years turning, "You cannot live here," into, "Then we'll build somewhere you never thought to look." The Ordanes delegate, whose people processed information through direct neural interface and rarely displayed anything resembling human emotion in council sessions, was recorded pausing for nearly 11 full seconds after reviewing Meridian Station's engineering schematics, an eternity, by Ordanes standards, before finally transmitting a single line into the official record. This was not predicted. It was, in its own understated way, one of the most significant admissions in Concorde history. News of Meridian Station didn't just reach the Concorde Assembly. It reached every species under Concorde governance, and the reactions that followed were as varied, complicated, and deeply human, in the truest sense of the word, as the discovery itself. Fear came first, and it came fastest from the Kesh Dominion. To a militarized empire that measured strength in territory and conquest, the idea that a species could simply manufacture livable territory out of empty space was deeply destabilizing. Kesh military strategists, whose entire doctrine assumed that controlling planets meant controlling populations, now had to reckon with a species that didn't need their planets at all. Internal Kesh communications, later declassified, revealed genuine anxiety at the highest levels. If humanity could build permanent settlements anywhere in the void, what exactly was there left to threaten them with? Captain Dross Kelvon, the officer who had first discovered Meridian Station, was quoted in a rare public statement that spread widely across Concorde networks: "We spent decades planning how to contain a species by controlling their worlds. They simply stopped needing worlds. Respect came next, slower and more reluctant, but unmistakable, particularly from smaller, less powerful Concord member species who had spent generations watching the same 9 founding civilizations divide up habitable worlds among themselves, leaving little room for latecomers. A minor aquatic species called the Thessan, whose entire homeworld had been rendered nearly uninhabitable by rising toxicity centuries earlier, reached out to Meridian Station directly, not through official Concord channels, but through a quiet, informal request for engineering consultation. They had spent generations petitioning the Concord for resettlement rights to a habitable world, and had spent generations being told, gently but firmly, to wait their turn behind older, more established species. Humanity said yes before the Concord even finished debating whether to allow the exchange. Within 18 months, the first Thessan human joint habitat, built using a hybrid of human structural engineering and Thessan aquatic life support technology, began construction in the same stretch of deep space as Meridian Station. It was the first time in recorded Concord history that a species denied a homeworld had helped build a permanent one for someone else. Regret arrived hardest, and most personally, for the Viralu. Dr. Amara Osei, still Earth's ambassador after all these years, was formally invited back to the Concord Assembly Chamber for the first time since the original ruling, the same obsidian chamber where she had once been told her species might be reconsidered, in perhaps 1,000 years. The Viralu speaker who delivered that original judgment was still in office. Ancient, patient, and by Viralu standards still relatively young in a lifespan measured in centuries, the speaker addressed Osei directly, and the recording of that exchange would go on to be studied in diplomatic academies across a dozen species for years afterward. Our assessment concluded your species lacked the stability to survive beyond your homeworld, the speaker said, the layered harmonics of Viralu's speech carrying none of the flat certainty it once had. We were not incorrect about your instability, Ambassador Osei. Humanity is, by every metric we possess, chaotic, argumentative, and slow to consensus. Osei said nothing, waiting. We were incorrect, the speaker continued, in assuming instability and inability were the same condition. It wasn't quite an apology. Viralu culture, ancient and rigid, had no real framework for the concept. But it was, by the careful, weighted standards of Concord diplomacy, as close to one as had ever been offered to any species in the Assembly's recorded history. Political change followed quickly, though not without resistance. Within 2 years of Meridian Station's discovery, the Concord's original habitability assessment framework, the very document that had denied humanity's colonization rights, was formally revised for the first time in over 3 centuries. The new framework no longer defined the species' right to expand based solely on suitable planets available. It included, for the first time, an entirely new category, demonstrated capacity for self-sufficient habitat engineering. Humanity hadn't just built itself a home. It had rewritten the rules for every species that came after it, including the ones who had once voted, without hesitation, to deny it a future. Admiration came slowest of all, but it came from the most unexpected place. The Ordanis, whose cold, efficient logic had once dismissed human decision-making as biological noise, sent a formal delegation to Meridian Station, not for diplomacy, but for study. What they found surprised even their carefully calibrated expectations. Meridian Station's governance wasn't run by a single optimized authority the way Ordani's systems operated. It was messy. Argumentative. Built on rotating councils, public disagreements, votes that sometimes failed and had to be reworked, engineers who disagreed loudly and passionately about design choices before eventually, painfully, reaching consensus. And yet, somehow, it worked. Not despite the chaos, but partly because of it. Every failure, the fatal early structural collapse, the years of failed harvests, the endless design revisions, had been absorbed, argued over, and turned into improvement, because no single flawed authority ever had unchecked control long enough to let a mistake go uncorrected. The lead Ordani's researcher, in a report that would later be widely quoted, wrote something that no Ordani's delegate had ever formally stated about another species before. Their instability is not a flaw in their design. It is their design. They do not eliminate disagreement. They survive it, repeatedly, and grow stronger for having survived it. By 2215, less than a decade after the discovery of Meridian Station, humanity's deep space network had grown into something the original Concord ruling could never have anticipated. Dozens of habitats. Hundreds of thousands of people. An engineering philosophy, modular, redundant, stubbornly self-reliant, that other species had begun studying, adapting, and in some cases directly licensing from human engineers who, 6 years earlier, hadn't even been allowed a seat at the Concord table. Dr. Amara Osei, older now, her hair gray, her voice a little quieter but no less steady, gave a speech at the opening of Meridian Station's new Central Assembly Hall, a speech broadcast, at the Concord's own request, across every member species' networks. She didn't talk about the ruling that had denied humanity a homeworld. She didn't talk about vindication, or victory, or proving anyone wrong. They told us we couldn't survive out here, she said, standing beneath a viewport that looked out over the quiet, endless dark of deep space. And they were right, in a way. Nothing about this place was supposed to support life. No planet. No sun close enough to matter. No gravity except the gravity we built ourselves, spinning this station in circles because the universe refused to give us one for free. She paused, letting the silence sit, the way she'd learned to let silence sit in 100 difficult negotiations. But they made one mistake. They measured us by what a home was supposed to look like. And we never needed it to look like anything. We just needed somewhere to stand, together, and start building. The story of humanity's deep space colonies never became a story about weapons, or conquest, or proving superiority over older, more powerful species. It became something the Concord itself, in its revised historical archives, eventually described simply as the first documented case of a species creating habitability, rather than finding it. That distinction mattered more than any military victory could have. Because the lesson the galaxy learned from humanity wasn't that humans were secretly stronger, or secretly smarter, or hiding some advanced technology behind their backs the whole time. The lesson was smaller, and somehow far more unsettling to civilizations built on ancient certainty and inherited power. Humanity's greatest strength had never been a weapon at all. It was the simple, stubborn refusal to accept impossible as a final answer, the willingness to fail, rebuild, argue, disagree, fail again, and keep going anyway, not because anyone believed they would succeed, but because giving up had simply never occurred to them as an option worth considering. The galaxy had spent 17 years deciding what humanity was allowed to become. Humanity spent 6 quiet years deciding for itself. And somewhere in the cold, empty dark between the stars, a place no atlas had ever marked as home, a place every species with the power to stop them had once agreed could never sustain life, humanity built one anyway. Not because the universe made room for them. Because they made the room themselves. End.